organic agriculture extension agent here on island. She has tons of experience all throughout the world, work on rice in California, work on rice and also community outreach in agriculture and throughout Southeast Asia, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, wherever, Sri Lanka, yeah, a few different places. She's going to be talking to us today a little bit about tropical fruit and then also about nuts. So we're going to see, we should be able to see both Emily talking and her share screen once the presentation starts. And then for folks here on Kauai, I'm going to try, we have some fruit in the back that we'll go over a little bit, time permitting. And then statewide folks, I'm going to try to join through my phone, and then we'll also kind of show you all that as we're going around with it. So Emily, thank you.
Great, thanks James for the introduction. So aloha everyone from Hawaii and across the state. I'm really excited to be here speaking with you all today. This is actually my first time back in the classroom in a year. So super exciting and great to see a lot of faces in front of me instead of just peeking at my webcam throughout the session. So let's see, I'll take a sec to get all the AV stuff going. And also want to just say, if at any time folks online, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat, and I think our coordinators on Neighbor Islands are going to be monitoring that. But also feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. And for folks in the room, feel free to jump in with questions at any time. Always happy to stop and make sure I'm not moving too quickly. Okay, let's see. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Russell, can you allow that? I'm on my phone, so. Give it a shot now. Let's see.
Great, there we go. Okay, except now our friends in the room here can't see it. So hang tight 1 second while we figure out some of this AV stuff. Appreciate your patience. All right, great. I think we got that figured out. Looks amazing. Okay, great. So thank you again. As I said, my name is Emily Kirk, and I'm an extension agent based here on Kauai, focusing on edible crops and sustainable and organic agriculture. And today we're talking about tropical fruit and nuts. We're going to focus mostly on the fruits. I realized in reviewing these slides, we kind of give short shrift to our very important macadamia nuts, but just a nod to them, and then we'll focus mostly on fruit today. But a lot of the principles that we're talking about apply to nut trees as well. Great. And so I also want to acknowledge Dr. Alyssa Cho and Dr. Rosemary Gutierrez and James Keach, who had a lot of input in putting these slides together. Alyssa Cho used to give this presentation, and she has since relocated back to the mainland, but appreciate the Mana'o and the foundation that they've built for us. So before I jump into the content, I also wanted to take a moment and say a big mahalo to all of the Master Gardeners, to all of you as trainees. And I saw we have some of our alumni online with us as well across the state. Really, we couldn't do our work as cooperative extension and reach nearly as many folks as we do without your help as Master Gardeners. So there's only so many of us agents and so many folks across the state who need support. So thank you so much for all that you do in helping us extend our reach. And just wanted to show as well just the magnitude of the impact that Master Gardeners do have. So this is data nationwide, 2016 with 43 states reporting, including Hawaii. And just to show that in 1 year, we had 5.5 million direct contacts with community members, over 5.8 million volunteer hours given by Master Gardeners. And this again is nothing, we couldn't come even close to this just extension without you. So thank you for what you do and for taking this first step of the journey and joining the training with us. Instead of putting these at the end, we put these at the beginning just to say there's lots and lots of great resources out there when it comes to tropical fruits, nuts, and horticulture in general. So if you don't remember what I say today, that's totally fine. There's lots of resources available to refer back to, and this presentation will be available to you all as a PDF afterwards, so you can click through these links. A lot of great material available from CTAR and from other extension services and other fruit and tree experts around the world. And under the current conditions with COVID, things are a little bit different still, but as far as connecting with the community, the Hawaii Tropical Fruit Growers is an awesome group. They've got chapters across the state on all islands. And usually they do a conference every year, which is a super fun event, very, very educational. They bring in speakers, experts from around the world to talk about different aspects of tropical fruit. And hopefully we can start having conferences in person again. I would encourage you all to connect with the group and to join when you can. Great. So today we're talking about fruit, right? So even after so many years of living in the tropics, there are still fruits that I don't know what they are. I've never eaten them. And it's so exciting because there's this incredible abundance and diversity out there across the tropics. And so when we're talking about fruit, what are we talking about exactly? So botanically speaking, fruit is the mature ovary, and fruit development really begins with the flowers. So we'll start there. So we're thinking about how fruits form. We know that they develop from the flower, and the fruit is really the mature ovary, which starts within the flower itself. So understanding flower structure is really interesting because it can tell us a lot about the fruit structure and vice versa. So if we're looking at a fruit in the marketplace, we can think about the shape structure of the flower that it might have developed from. So I know you all had basic botany already. This should be very, very familiar. But looking at the flower, this is an example of a complete flower with both male and female parts. There's the pedicel, which is the flower stem. Then the ovary, which contains the ovules here in the middle, the stigma and the style for receiving pollen, and then the male parts on the side, the stamen with the anthers that disperse the pollen when it is mature. And there's a number of signals that a plant will receive that might induce it to flower. In some cases, it has to do with the photoperiod. So that's the number of hours, the length of daylight that it receives. Sometimes it's also a dry period. So it could be, if you think, for example, depending on how the pollen is distributed, the plant might need a time when it's not raining so that the pollen has a better chance of actually being distributed. And sometimes cold temperatures as well. So, we see this especially in a lot of temperate crops where they need a certain number of cold hours during the season before they'll actually set flowers. And then if we don't have those chilling hours, we're not going to get any fruit, right? No flowers, no fruit. So in addition to that, it's also has to do with a bit of the age of the tree. So the age of the branch specifically that they're on. And then also fertilization and water status. So if the tree is nutrient stressed, that might cause a difference in flowering. And then the overall health of the tree is important as well. So this slide is showing a number of different types of flowers. So for example, we have a spike on the left. So this is what we see in a pineapple, for example. And this has individual flowers. And then it goes in these circles. Oh, can't hear me. Okay, thank you. Likewise, if our friends online, if you have trouble hearing, let me know. I'll try to speak up. I didn't necessarily choose the best mask today. This one likes to suction into my face a little bit. So we'll do what we can. Is this better? Okay. How about now? Okay, cool. I'll try to project more. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, so different types of flowers. So we're looking at the architecture here. So for example, the spike on the left, that's a pineapple. And there are other fruits that have this same flower structure as well. And on the diagram, each of the circles represents a complete individual flower. And in the case of a spike, they're flowers that do not have pedicels, so we don't have that short flower stem. This is a re-scheme for a different architecture. The example is a macadamia nut. So these are individual flowers that have a pedicel and are arranged along the stem that way. And then on the far right, we see a candle. This is a super common structure, lychee, mango, avocado, and they are individual flowers, but they have this higher branching architecture along the inflorescence. So again, you see the individual flowers with a pedicel, but more of a complex branching structure. Yeah, so lychee, mango, rambutan, longan, all of those would have pedicels. And we also characterize the fruit based on the type of the fruit, so the structure of the fruit itself. We have simple fruits like mango, for example, which form from a single ovary. And so these are all of the drupes and home fruits, so things like apples, plums, apricots, also the berries, tomato and avocado. And then we have aggregate fruits in the middle. So these are forming from multiple ovaries within a single flower. An example here is one of my favorites, is known as mimosa, the sugar apple, but also things like raspberries and blackberries, for example. And then on the right-hand side, you have multiple fruits. So these are forming from many flowers that are tightly clustered and have fused ovaries. So the example here, this is a jackfruit, but also breadfruit, mulberry, fig, And even the pineapple and noni are all examples of fruits that are multiple fruits. And some of the factors that go into the productivity of our trees or any of our crops, really, it's always going to be an interaction between genetics and the environment. So the genetic components are things like the variety or the cultivar, and some of that will be determined when we're selecting them also by our method of propagation. So for example, if we're doing vegetative propagation, we have a little bit more control over the genetics versus if we're propagating from seed, for example, where we're going to have more of a variability. And then the environmental factors are super important. So these are all the aspects of the growing conditions, location, soil, all the climatic factors, and also our cultural practices, the management and the control that we do have over the environment. Things like fertilization, pruning, and all of that. So together, these factors, the genetics and then the environment, are going to combine to have that influence on what our fruit and that productivity is. And so I believe you all had botany and propagation already, is my understanding, yeah? Awesome. So a lot of this will just be a quick review. So propagation methods, again, there's sexual propagation through seeds, where we have, again, that higher genetic variability. And then vegetative propagation methods. So for fruit trees, and for trees in general, we're looking especially at grafting and air layering. So grafting, as you remember, we'll talk a little bit more about each of these. We'll talk a little bit more about grafting. Air layering is, again, where you're removing some of the outer bark down to the cambium, and then wrapping. You can think of it as like taking a cutting basically off of a woody plant, right? So if we're rooting it before we remove it from the mother plant. So take off a bit of that outer bark, wrap it with something that's going to hold moisture like sphagnum or cocoa, and then some plastic to keep the moisture in. Once the roots form, you can cut it, and then you have a new tree. It's basically a clone of the parent. And grafting we'll get into in a second. So I just wanted to point out, I know you can't read this, it's way too small, but this is an example of a really useful CTAR publication that talks about propagation methods for tropical fruit trees. So if you're interested in propagating something specific, I suggest this is a place to start. The table on the right-hand side here goes through a wide range of tropical fruits, their scientific names, so you can make sure that you're talking about what you think you're talking about. And then it recommends recommended or not recommended propagation methods. So seed propagation, cuttings, air layer, and grafting. And it gives you a sense about if it's possible at all, but with difficulty, or if it's really that most common, most recommended method.
So there was a request if you could use the mouse to point things.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Cool. Yeah, so that definitely, sorry about that. So yeah, here the table on the right-hand side. We've got a little bit of rain and a little bit of road noise, so I'll try to project for the folks here and not forget about all our friends across the waters too. So again, just an example, there are a lot of CTAR publications out there that give more technical information and are great resources for ourselves, but also to share with home gardeners, right? When we start to do the outreach in the community and we're getting questions from folks. So an example of a fruit tree that we do actually grow from seed is the papaya. So papayas are herbaceous perennials. They're a little bit unusual. Mostly we don't grow fruit trees from seed because, again, there's that variability. But we have some good hybrid varieties, and there's, because papayas are relatively short-lived and the hybrids are stable enough, we get good quality fruit growing those. And it's very cheap. It's cheap, it's quick. And then just to mention that there is one GM variety of papaya that's available in the marketplace. So that's the rainbow papaya. And they're commonly grown on the Big Island, not as much on the other islands. But for home garden purposes, the hybrids like the Sunrise, Sunset are totally sufficient. And there's lots and lots of other varieties out there as well to explore. So a quick grafting review. So this is a vegetative propagation technique, very common for fruit trees, where we have a rootstock, a rootstock that gives some kind of characteristic or some kind of advantage that we want in many cases. So that could be something that is disease resistant. Maybe it's more tolerant of wet feet. Maybe it gives it, especially for fruit trees, dwarfing characteristics are very important. And then we want to make sure that whatever we're using in the rootstock, that it's going to be compatible with the scion. So the scion is that that budwood, that upper part. This is going to grow into the tree and produce the fruit that we actually want. So the scion is usually something of a known variety that has good characteristics, and it's of reproductive age. So you want to make sure that it's correctly aged, it's at the right development stage for grafting, for one, but also that it because it isn't as young, say, developmentally, it's going to give us fruit a lot faster than if we were growing just from seed. So some of the commonly grafted tropical fruit nuts include macadamia, mango, coffee, avocado, lychee, longan, citrus, all kinds. So if you want, again, if you want that known variety, something you know is going to give you good fruit and is going to produce a lot sooner, grafting is really a good investment and the way to go. The other advantage, often we use seeds to grow the rootstock. The advantage there is that the seedlings themselves develop that nice taproot. So comparing that to something like air layering, for example, where air layering, you're not going to get the same type of strong taproot development in many cases. So even if you can air layer some of those larger species like, lychee, rambutan, mango, avocado, for example, that grow into these really, really big trees, they're not going to be as stable when they're older if they don't have that strong taproot. So that's another reason that grafting is recommended. So one example, thinking about why we might want to invest the time and energy, benefits of grafting, is to talk about the charwell avocado. So in the last few years, we were able to get approval to export charwell avocados to the mainland, except California. And this is huge for the industry, because we have tons and tons of delicious, super awesome avocados out here. But because of export restrictions, there's not a lot of market for them beyond Hawaii. So this increases the market dramatically. And you want to be able to say that for sure, these avocados that I'm exporting are charwell, so that they're going to be approved. And to do that, you need to graft. And since you did go over this in detail, I'll just mention briefly, there are lots of different grafting techniques, and it's one of those things, it's an art and a science. So once you understand the science behind it, then it's just a matter of doing it, practicing again and again to really get your hand developed and to get that good feel for it. And there's these great videos that Ty McDonald, one of our extension agents and Master Gardener coordinators over in Kona, put together very clear series that I'd recommend you check out to see a little bit more of an example. And then when you have some time, even if you're not going to actually grow the trees out, just to practice. So avocado is a great one because, avocado pits are pretty easy to sprout. And then once you get the tree at the right size, you can even practice just cutting it and grafting it back to itself. Guaranteed compatibility, not guaranteed graft success, but it's just to get that practice in.
And that video is on the playlist. So if you look through the playlist of the recordings, both this part 1 and part 2 are on that.
Awesome. So I wanted to talk a little bit about plant growth and development. And this is especially important when we're managing perennial crops. It's important for any kind of crops, but especially for perennials, understanding the difference. So growth is really getting bigger, but development is maturing. And when we have a young tree, or even when we're thinking about young wood on our trees, understanding the life cycle and the different phases is going to be important because it informs our management timing decisions. So for example, when are we going to fertilize? When are we going to prune? Maybe when are we going to apply certain pesticides or other kind of pest control practices? That'll be really depend on the development stages, or what we call the phenology of the plant. So this is an example here from mango, just to show you the top graph shows the progression of the flowers budding, and then flowering and fruit set, followed by that fruit growth, and then a vegetative flush, followed by the root flush, as an example. And then the other example down below, you'll see slightly different patterns where, again, flower bud, flowers and fruit growth. But in this one, you see that vegetative flush and that root flush are more distributed throughout. So just to say that understanding the specific crop that you're growing is really important so that you can time the management accordingly. It's not just going to be like a one size fits all. So looking a little bit, we're going to go through some of the different important management practices for orchard crops, including pruning, just maintaining the tree height for appropriate management and other benefits, fertilizing, harvesting, and then we'll talk a little bit about pest management, some of the major diseases, insects, weeds, and bird pests that you might be dealing with for your orchards.
You have a question about vegetative and root flush?
Okay. Okay, great. So just to explain it a little bit more. Perfect. So the vegetative flush is something that's easier for us to see. So I'm thinking about, again, mango as an example, because it's really, really clear. This is the vegetative flush is when all of those new leaves come out. And on mango, it's super clear because a lot of the varieties have different color leaves when they first come out before they turn to their full green. So that's the vegetative flush. And the root flush we don't really see, right? Because that's happening underground, but it's the same thing. So it's the time during the tree's growth cycle through the year when it's diverting energy down into the roots and growing a lot of new roots. So I actually was happy that I threw this hoodie on today. It's a little cold, but you can kind of think like as above, so below, right? So we see, you can think we often live in this kind of above ground world and take for granted what's happening below ground. But for a tree, you can think there's this incredible branching architecture up above. There's that equal branching complexity happening down below. And again, the timing of that is really important, especially for, I'd say, especially for fertilizing and for pruning. Those are the two biggest ones, because the fertilizing, that's us like basically giving that plant fuel, giving it food so that it can make those flushes. And pruning is going to be that kind of other direction, right? Like we're taking away its photosynthetic capacity, we're cutting back some of its energy sources. So we want to time that, like when do we want, when would we want to be basically shocking and starving our trees momentarily versus when do we want to be feeding them and fueling that growth? A great question, thank you. Cool. Okay, so let's jump into pruning a little bit. And I know in previous years there was Andy Kaufman would do pruning demonstrations. I don't know if that's not this year yet. Okay, cool. So pruning. A lot of times if we're in the temperate zone, you know, it's pretty easy to tell when to prune, right? Because you get that long period of dormancy for most crops. But in the tropics, it's a little bit more subtle. So again, it'll depend on the tree, but in most cases, the best time to prune is after it's finished fruiting, which makes sense, right? You want to get your harvest in and then come through and prune. So there's a lot of reasons that we prune, and part of it is maintaining tree height. This is a big one because there's a lot of advantages to having shorter trees. So ease of management, ease of harvest, and in some cases you can actually really pump out a lot of fruit. You can have more efficient orchards with smaller trees as well. Versus these really huge, and I mean, we've all seen them, right? In the landscape, there's these massive mangoes, massive avocado, massive lychee trees. And you think like, how on earth am I gonna get up there to harvest all of that fruit? You know, even if you have a 15-foot orchard ladder, it's risky and it's humbug to get all the way up there. Probably the birds are gonna get to it first. And it's dangerous. So from a production standpoint as well, there's a lot of benefits to having the shorter trees. We also prune for pest and disease control. So often when we're going out to look at and start to prune a tree, one of the first things you want to look for are dead, diseased, or infested branches. Anything that's, and also anything that's broken, because a broken branch is basically a buffet of invitation for disease and for insects to come and feast. So for field sanitation, it's really important. For harvesting, I mentioned this already, as far as ease of harvesting. And then for fruit quality and fruit quantity. So this relates back also to thinking about the developmental stage of the actual wood, because depending on the tree, it might need a certain age of wood to actually set flowers and set fruit. So in many cases, pruning helps to rejuvenate. You get a new fresh flush of growth. You're going to get more flowers and more fruit. Also, the fruit quality is important because if we can allow better airflow through the tree, better light penetration, you might get, for example, more uniform fruit development and less disease instances. That airflow is really important. And in some cases, we also prune to promote annual bearing. So annual bearing versus alternate bearing, where a lot of trees tend to, in certain years, they will just have these massive bumper crops, kind of overproduce themselves. And then the following year, they might have very, very little or to nothing at all. So by having some pruning and also managing that, mitigating that overproduction, we can encourage trees to produce the fruit that we want to eat every year. And we also prune to revive an old tree. So I think about this very poorly managed lychee tree that was in the backyard of a place I was renting recently. And the tree is huge, and in 3 years, I think it probably produced, you know, this many, like maybe 75 lychee over this huge tree over 3 years, and it really needed to be revived. And this is a lot of work because we want to, again, get up into these massive trees and then step them back kind of incrementally. Maybe it might take over a couple of years even. You don't want to just chop it all back all at once. but stepping that back till you get to a point where your tree is manageable again, and also where it's going to be healthy and vigorous again. So this video, sorry, I should have put a screenshot on there, but I understand this is also on your playlist. So this is a video that shows a progression of mango pruning, and it is excellent. It's the best pruning video that I've seen because it shows very clearly, especially if you're working on training a young tree, which is always the best. If you can like prune when your tree is this high and hip high and shoulder high and still manageable, to get that good architecture at the beginning, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache and a lot of expense in the long run. So this is nice because it shows step by step from, again, from a very young tree, what that prune looks like, and then also how that grows and progresses to build that architecture. So you can start to just get that pattern in your mind. So the next topic is floral forcing. And this is something that we actually get questions about pretty often from home growers. So floral forcing is basically anything that we can do from a management perspective to stimulate our tree to produce flowers. We get questions a lot. We'll get a call from a home gardener who says, you know, I have this rambutan tree in my backyard. It's been here for 12 years and it's never given me fruit a single time. You know, I have, and then what are we going to do? What can we do about it? So again, why floral force? Because no flowers, no fruit, and that's what we're most interested in, aside from the shade and the beauty of the tree. And so then how do we actually do that? There's a few examples. So for lychee, trunk girdling is one approach. You'll notice a lot of the floral forcing techniques have to do with stressing out the tree. So if we think about that, right, from kind of an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense because, again, the tree wants to reproduce itself and continue its species. So it has to make fruit to do that. It has to set flowers to do that. So if we can stress it where it thinks, ah, yeah, this is my last chance, okay, do it. Like put everything we've got into making those flowers and hopefully getting some fruit out. So trunk girdling, that's where you don't want to girdle all the way and kill your tree, but giving it enough, like cutting through the bark just enough to give it that stress signal. So longan is using potassium chlorate. So a slightly different approach. You'll notice there's potassium compounds that are also used in floral forcing because potassium is probably the most limiting nutrient for fruit development. So this is the other side of like, you know, kind of like that carrot versus stick thing. Maybe that's a bad metaphor. Anyway, instead of stressing the tree, we tell it, hey, you've got an abundance of potassium right now. Like if you're ever going to make fruit, if you're ever going to set flowers and make fruit, like you're rich, now's the time to do it. And then for rambutan, again, going back to that stress signal, this time using a water stress, basically simulating a drought instead of that trunk girdling. And this is really hard to do in an orchard. But if you're a home gardener, maybe you only have a couple of trees, you know, you can put basically tarps out to divert the rain away from the roots and simulate a drought scenario. So not very feasible in a big orchard, although in the photo here you can see it can be done. So then mango is our next one here. And this is a combination of that tip pruning and potassium nitrate, so fertilizer. So again, pushing it with that potassium, letting it know, hey, you've got the resources you need to make fruit. And then the tip pruning specifically for mango is really important because all of the inflorescence will come out tend to come out right at the branch tips. So by pruning the tips back, you give just, again, to stimulate that growth where it would set panicles if it's going to. Any questions on any of that material so far? Sure. So the like we talked at the beginning, like for example, in mangoes, the panicles, right? The structure that has all of the flowers on it. So those will come out right at the branch tips in mango. So by pruning them back, you stimulate that growth where they would come from. And by combining that with the potassium nitrate, gives the tree that signal like, cool, we can do that flowering thing if we're going to.
Pruning the flowers in order to, and adding the potassium nitrate in order to make more flowers again.
So sorry, I realized you folks online might not be able to hear. The question is about, I used the word inflorescence, and again about the tip pruning for mangoes. So sorry if that was confusing. You prune it when you don't have any flowers yet. There's not, it's only vegetative growth. Yeah. So these are techniques, if your tree isn't flowering at all, things you can try to maybe get it to flower. Again, no guarantees. Again, thinking about, for a second, putting on the Master Gardener hat on the helpline, if you have a home gardener who comes in with this question, you got to do a little bit of detective work first to get some background information. In many cases, it could also be that they have a seedling tree that they are growing out and they're just waiting that it might flower. And maybe 12 years isn't long enough to wait. There's a lot of trees that might take from seed, it might take 15 years or more before it sets fruit. So that, again, those are some of that detective work we do on the backside before we try to give solutions. But if they say, hey, this is a grafted tree, like it's a good one, it should be producing, or it produced 5 years ago, but nothing since, then we can try floral forcing to see if we can give it the encouragement that it needs to go from that vegetative growth into producing flowers, and then hopefully get some fruit. Grafting question?
Someone told me that grafting makes trees that doesn't have as long of a life.
So the question is, one of the folks here on Kauai had heard that sometimes grafted trees don't live as long as seedling trees. I haven't heard that specifically. As long as there's always that point of vulnerability in the graft union, but once they're, as long as that heals well and it's a solid graft and it's growing healthy otherwise, I haven't heard anything about them living shorter than seedlings. I see James shaking his head in agreement. Any comments from other coordinators across the island on that?
This is Ty. I haven't heard that either. The ungrafted trees will get larger over time than grafted ones, but I haven't heard anything about shorter lifespans.
Perfect. Thank you, Ty. So for those here in the room who probably couldn't hear, that was Ty McDonald over in Kona, and he was saying that he hadn't heard anything about the longevity of the tree, that seedling trees will tend to grow much larger than the grafted trees. But as far as the lifespan, he hasn't come across that either.
Why does a grafted tree take less time to convert to a pruning stage than
Great. And follow-up question then, why does it take less time for a grafted tree to reach maturity and begin bearing fruit than for a seedling? And that's because the scion, that top part or the budwood, is already, it brings with it the maturity that it has accumulated to date. So it's going to be older and more mature than the comparable height of a seedling would be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Great questions. Alrighty. Was there anyone online that wanted to chime in?
A few questions. I don't know if you want to do them now or.
Okay, I think up to you.
So, since there, a few of them are with grafting,
Yeah.
one was when dealing with the newly grafted fruit tree, is it important to prune any new growth below the graft line, or is there a specific time to just cut them off as they grow?
That is an awesome, awesome question. Question about if you want, basically about pruning any growth that comes up off of that rootstock. Super important. This is probably one of the most common ways that we lose, that especially home gardeners might lose grafted trees, because that rootstock, often we choose rootstock that's really vigorous, right? Because we want it to impart some of that vigor to the scion, to that variety that we want. But if we don't cut off those suckers that are going to keep growing anything below the graft union, we call that root sucker, basically, or rootstock suckering. Any buds that are there, if they send out suckers, that is just going to totally starve your scion in many cases. So cut them off. Check your trees often. Cut them off as soon as you see them, and you got to keep up with that until hopefully at some point the scion becomes dominant enough that you're not going to keep getting that suckering. But yeah, super important. I would say do that early, often, and keep an eye out for it. And it's really good to make sure you know where your graft union is, because sometimes they can be really sneaky. And you think, oh, this bud, this is coming from the scion, but actually it's coming from the rootstocks just at or below that graft union. And when you come back, if you don't notice it, and you come back and try and think you've got this sweet, juicy tangerine, and it's just bitter and completely full of seeds, you'll know that something might have gone wrong early on. You know, citrus is really an obvious one, because a lot of the citrus rootstock we use grows these really wicked thorns too. So you come out and you're like, man, why does this one tree in my orchard have all of these thorns on it? And well, look a little closer and see. That might have been just one sneaky rootstock sucker that we missed early on. So super, super important to do that early and often. That's a good question.
We have a question about what percentage of the tree is safe to prune at once?
So what percentage of the tree? I think generally we talk about not taking more than a third as kind of a guideline. But it'll depend on the size of the tree, the health of the tree, and the trees, like some of them they can really take a beating. I would not recommend it. Following that, bringing it back by a third, and then waiting, and then a third. So if you have a really big tree you're trying to get under control, for example, but you will see it all the time driving around. You'll see folks, especially mango trees, and they just butcher them. They whack it back to almost nothing. And you think, you're like, oh, are they taking the tree out? Or what are they doing? And they'll still come back in most cases, but that's not recommended. So just general guideline, I'd say probably not more than a third.
One last
One more?
question
Yeah.
along those lines, and I think the other one will stay for here.
Cool.
Is it ever too late to cut off those suckers, even if they're pretty big?
Is it ever too late to cut off the suckers? I think my optimistic answer is to say no, as long as you still have some amount of your scion that's alive. So as long as the scion, right, that desirable top portion of the tree, as long as the graft is successful and you can see that the scion is still alive and growing, you can step it back. You can continue to cut that root sucker back until you see that the scion is in balance and getting that growth that you want. But again, I'd also, just to say that might not always be practical or the most desirable approach. So it'll really depend on a case-by-case basis, how big the tree is, how long it's gone, how important it is to you. Yeah, so for that, I'll just give one quick example. Here in Wailua, we have a cacao orchard of 100 grafted trees that we put in. And there's one, we'll get into this a little more with the cacao, but when you plant the young trees, we're growing them inside of tree shelters. So it's really hard to check for the suckers. You know, we checked them all before we planted them in the field, but then they're kind of hiding in those shelters, in those cages, for several months. And when we took the cages off, 99 trees looked great. One of them had only this tiny little bit of scion left, and the majority of the tree, you know, 4 feet tall, was a rootstock sucker that had grown up around it. But in this case, because it's a research project and the tree was still alive, and I'm not a commercial grower, so I don't value my own time in quite the same way, I decided that it was worth it to cut that rootstock sucker back and try to give the scion a chance versus having a missing data point in our research trial. And it seems to be doing okay, but it's going to, you know, again, it's going to be a project that you have to then keep a close eye on if you want to do that. So better just to check your trees often and get those suckers off as soon as you see them. Because again, it's stealing energy basically from the tree that you want to be growing. Cool. Awesome. Great. Thank you for the questions. Again, don't want to forget about all of our friends out there in Zoom land. Cool. Great. So another flowering issue we wanted to touch on briefly is blossom drop and premature fruit drop. So there's some amount of blossom and fruit drop that is expected, even desirable. So an example from avocado, you know, one big mature avocado tree might have even as many as 1 million flowers on it. So if every one of those flowers, it's not practical or desirable to have every one of those flowers, even from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Have all 1 million flowers develop into 1 million itty bitty avocados and then plant 1 million seedlings right beneath yourself. So you're going to get a lot, like the majority of those blossoms are going to fall. And the same thing with fruit. So if there's a really heavy fruit set year, the tree will often abort some amount of that fruit early on so that it has more resources and more energy to give to the few that it's going to keep and grow to full maturity. But there are sometimes issues, and it could be a disease issue. You know, for example, in wetter areas, something like anthracnose can cause a lot of blossom drop in mangoes, for example. And it can also be a nutrient imbalance. So if you feel like your tree has excessive blossom drop or fruit drop, and you're not getting anything growing to maturity, that's when you want to dig a little bit deeper and see if there's, for example, a nutrient issue that's underlying that phenomenon. And the photo here, just to show source and sink, when we're growing, we as if we're the tree, when the trees are growing fruit, the fruit is a very important and strong sink for resources. And it's the leaves and the rest of the tree that are the source of that energy. So in some cases, there could be also an imbalance, perhaps. So for example, if your tree itself is really stressed or diseased or has a low nutrient status, it's not able to provide adequately for this strong resource sink, which is the fruit that's growing. Cool. So with that, we'll jump a little bit into nutrient management. Sorry? Oh, good break time. Okay, cool. Yeah, we're at about 50 minutes. So I will pause it here and let's take, what do we want to do? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Anyone's fine. Okay, great. So we'll do a 10-minute break. My clock says 9:55. We'll come back at 10:05. Okay, awesome. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, we need to turn it. Thank you.
See you back at 10:05. Oh, yeah, totally. Cool. I get to see over to East Hawaii. Okay. All right, everyone, welcome back. It's 10:05, so we're gonna keep going here. I think we had a couple more questions in the chat box that we're gonna touch on before we jump into nutrient management.
So we were talking about what is the difference between potassium nitrate and potassium chlorate, and when do you use one or the other?
Okay, so at the most basic level, so we're talking about floral forcing and which kind of potassium compound to use. So I'll say this, at the most basic level, they're just different chemical compounds, right? So potassium nitrate is probably a more common fertilizer, and the potassium chlorate is just more like a salt. It's not something that we would necessarily, it's not, I mean, I guess it's still a good potassium source, but it's something to be cognizant of, because that chlorate, the chloride, some plants are sensitive to chloride. So again, you want to make sure that you know, this is where it's really important in so many aspects of horticulture, that you really know, you get to know the specific characteristics of the plants that you're working with. So if you have longan, the recommendation is potassium chlorate. With mango, it's potassium nitrate. And unless you're doing research for a particular reason, I wouldn't think that they're very interchangeable. So I would stick with that recommendation. And if you have other species that you're interested in that are not included here, definitely take the time to do the research from reputable sources first, before going out and applying something to your field. Maybe you don't, maybe for example, the tree that you're working with is really sensitive to chloride, and you put potassium chlorate out there, you could be doing some substantial damage. And once it's in the soil, it's really hard to get it back out.
By adding those, are you going to affect the pH?
Great question. So the question about if you're going to affect the pH, and it's definitely possible. I'm not sure specifically for these two potassium compounds, but that's a good question, because other types of fertilizer, other types of amendments, that's always something to keep in mind as well.
So there's a question about how do you prune a tree with multiple grafts of different styles?
Okay, so if you have a grafting tree, then sometimes we call them like fruit salad trees, or you have multiple different, multiple varieties, or even multi-species in some cases on one tree. This again is going to come back. I would definitely spend a little extra time pruning, being extra mindful when you're pruning a tree like that, because there tends to be, when you have multiple grafts, or even if you have multiple grafts of the same variety, same species, there can easily be an imbalance. You might just have one graft that is for some reason more vigorous than the other. It could be that that particular scion was a little bit healthier, a little more vigorous, or the graft was a little bit cleaner, or for some reason there's an imbalance. So just like when the discussion that we had about the rootstock suckers, where we want to make sure and get those off so that they're not starving the tree, you want to make sure if you have multiple grafts that you're doing your best effort to keep them balanced, so that you don't have a dominant one that continues to grow at a greater rate than the other and basically starve out its friends on the same tree. And so this is going to be kind of a balancing act too, right? Because you also need to follow all the best pruning practices. So making sure that you're taking out anything that's dead, diseased, or infested, things that are broken, branches that are crossing or giving an undesirable architecture. You still want to make sure that you have that picture in your mind, what you want the tree to look like, but then add to it that other layer of keeping the various grafts, the various scion, as close to balanced as possible, so that they are both able to continue growing. Cool. Awesome. Thanks for the questions. We'll keep going. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, and mahalo to James and the other coordinators for monitoring the chat since I can't see it from my end. Great. So nutrient management. So when we're talking about fruit trees, we're talking about trees in general, perennial crops, tissue sampling becomes really, really important. So hopefully you all had nutrient management or intro to soils with Dr. Dinek already. Yes, soils?
Yeah.
Yes, awesome, cool. So you understand a lot of the foundation about the importance of soils, the different types of nutrients, and soil sampling. But when we're talking about perennial crops and trees, fruit trees, nut trees in particular, tissue sampling is really important. We want to be ideally coupling the two together. So as I mentioned throughout, knowing your crop is really important. So this will be important for understanding how to take that tissue sample. So tissue, in this case, we're talking about leaves, basically. You want to take leaves from the tree and match that to see what the nutrient status of the tree is in this moment. And we want to make sure that the sample is representative. So again, in many cases, you want to double check in the references which exact leaf to sample, but for a lot of trees, it's that youngest fully matured leaf. And then making sure that it's representative of the tree as a whole. So you don't want to take leaves that have soil or dust on them because the concentrations in the leaf are often really low, and even a little bit of dust could contaminate that sample. You don't want to take anything that's damaged by insects, disease, or mechanical injury, because when the leaves get damaged like that, the tree will often translocate nutrients if it can. It'll take the mobile nutrients out of those leaves. So again, it's not going to be representative of the overall. And then anything from a dead or senescent plant, well, dead, that's pretty obvious. Senescent plants, same thing. So senescent means it's yellowing, often going into a dormancy or dropping leaves for a different reason. Same thing, it's translocating those nutrients out, it's not representative. And then from plants that are water or temperature stressed. So again, not going to be representative.
Is there a best time to do sample?
Great question. So the question was, is there a best time to take a sample? So I think what I would suggest is the best time to take a sample is enough ahead of when you want to fertilize in order to get your results back from the lab and make sure that you can get the fertilizer that you need so that you can give it to the plant. So that'll be dependent on understanding, if you think all the way back to when we had that graph with the progression of the different life phases for the development through the year. So I think, okay, well, what fertilizer do I want to apply? When does the plant need that food? So could be at the beginning, for example, at the beginning of the leaf flush for certain nutrients, or it could be at the beginning of the flower set for others. So again, keeping that in mind, and then give yourself maybe, depends on which lab you're using, but assume that it's going to take maybe 3 weeks to get, in some cases, 3 weeks to get your results back, because especially for us on the neighbor islands, you have to mail them somewhere. Maybe you have to mail it to another place, and then wait for the results. And then making sure that you have access to the fertilizers that you need. Is that kind of answer? Great question. And the same is true for soil sampling, right? It's going to take a little bit of time to get those results back. Okay, so the sampling procedure itself often is very, very simple. Just make sure you have the leaf you want. Get off, and then when you're preparing the samples, you want to make sure that you put them into a clean and dry, usually dry unless they ask you to keep it moist for some reason, but into a clean plastic bag with your name, the sample ID on it, a date, and a location, so that when you look back at the results 3 weeks later, you know where this information came from, and you can use that for your management. And the ADSC, that's the Agriculture Diagnostic Service Center, that's based over at UH Manoa. So that's CTAR's analytic lab, and they do accept tissue samples for nutrient analysis. This table is just as again an example, and a show for each crop the leaf that you want to sample. So recommendations. Most recently matured leaf, or something just below that. Banana's a little bit different. You actually take a strip of leaf from the middle section of the leaf. And then as well here, there's recommendations for the time to sample. So it'll really depend on the crop that you're growing. And then as far as soil sampling, similar kind of ideas, right? Make sure we have a bag that's well labeled so we can refer back to it once we get our results. And as far as the location, to take the sample around the tree, you want to pick kind of midway between the trunk and the drip line. So the drip line is that outer edge of the tree canopy. Step in about halfway to the trunk from there, and then try to, pick a spot where you're not going to be digging into any too much on the major roots. And then using a clean tool so that we're not contaminating the sample, and dig 6 to 12 inches down. So when we're sampling for in our gardens for vegetable crops, usually we do 0 to 4, 0 to 6 inches, something in that range. But for trees, because again, much more massive root structure, we want to get a little bit deeper in the soil so that we have a better understanding of what the tree is actually experiencing. Same thing, we want to make sure it's representative. And if you have multiple trees, this recommendation is for a half a cup to 1 cup per tree. But if you only have one tree that you're interested in, I would just suggest taking those kind of smaller samples around the perimeter. Maybe take 3 or 4 or 5 until you get about the 2 cups that you need for analysis. And then mix those together really well, and then send the 2 cups total off to the lab for analysis. And when you're looking at soil in particular, just kind of common sense, but want to make sure that you're not taking a soil sample right after you have fertilized. So this will definitely confound your results. Recommendation is about once a year, and ideally you do it before you plan to fertilize, so that again you can get a sense about making sure the fertilizer you're putting out is just that right rate to satisfy the plant needs.
What were the results you get back? Just NPK, or they give you trace, or what?
Great, so there's a question here about what the results are that come back from the sampling, and that'll depend on which analyses you select. So a lot of like the most basic analysis, I think it's $12 per sample. It's very, very reasonable. From ADSC, will mostly just give you the base cations. So potassium, magnesium, what does it do? Potassium, magnesium, calcium, and phosphorus. So that's kind of the quick, cheap, easy basics. But then you can go up from there. And a lot of labs will also offer kind of like a comprehensive soil package too. The NPK and salinity, pH. pH is super, super important. Hopefully Dr. Dienig hammered that in, but whatever you're testing, even if you test nothing else, test at least the pH of your soil, because that's going to have a huge influence on nutrient availability overall. Alrighty, so next, jumping into pest management. And a pest is really, oftentimes it's really subjective, right? You know, there's this expression, a weed is just a plant out of place. So pest, again, from that kind of anthropocentric view, but for us, super important. And I think the plants, a lot of the plants that we care for would agree with us too. So some of the major fruit diseases that we have here in Hawaii to watch out for, anthracnose is one of the big ones. So this is something that affects mangoes, papaya, avocado, and others. And again, especially in wet areas. So for example, Hilo, I'm sure is the same, but here on the east side of Kauai, I have growers who just year after year are losing almost their entire mango crops to anthracnose. And it's very difficult to control. Also, Phytophthora is another big one. Cacao and papaya are two of the particularly heavily impacted crops. Again, these are diseases that affect a very wide range of plants and are pretty ubiquitous in the environment, which again makes them super hard to control. But as an example, on papaya, you know, if you see a papaya tree that just spontaneously keels over, you know, chances are that the Phytophthora has attacked the roots and caused like a root rot, basically. And there's not a lot you can do about that. So when we're talking about fungal diseases, so anthracnose is a fungal disease. Phytophthora is not a fungal organism, but it's a similar type of organism and moves in the environment and thrives in the same kind of conditions as the fungal diseases do. They tend to spread, they produce spores, and they tend to spread with rain splash or with water. So again, the rain is nothing we can do about that. That's why we see this heavy prevalence in the wet areas, and why I always say like Wailua up here where we are is a great place to study fungal diseases, because it's going to rain on us almost every day of the year. So we'll talk a little bit more about how you can control these. Basically, we want to be bringing in our integrated pest management approaches, including things like sanitation, but also, you know, knowing that there are some control options, things like fungicides that are specific to the crop that you have at your disposal as well. Have you already had the pest? I should have asked for the schedule beforehand, but have you had the pest management lecture already? No, not yet. Okay, cool. So this will be a teaser, like a little sneak preview to the integrated pest management session when that comes up in the schedule. So for folks, this might be then the first time you're seeing this disease triangle. And this is basically just a kind of a conceptual model that helps us understand diseases across the board. It's not specific to plants necessarily. So there's the three sides of the triangle that contribute to this instance of disease. So for one, you need to have some kind of virulent pathogen. And we're learning a lot about this. We've been learning a lot about this over the last year, I think. So you have some kind of virulent pathogen, but then also you need to have a susceptible host. So just because the pathogen is in the environment, you know, it might be just existing in the soil, for example, but if there's no susceptible host around, well, it doesn't really necessarily matter that much. You're not going to have the disease outbreak. And then similarly, the conducive environment is that third part of the triangle down below here. So where you have, again, with the example of fungal diseases, you know, you have that like super wet environment, or if it's a virus that's vectored by an insect, for example, you know, part of that conducive environment might be the presence of that insect vector to spread the virus from plant to plant. And then the result is that disease. So when we're doing fruit disease diagnostics, and IPM in general, one of the most important places to start is by correctly identifying the disease and the cause of the symptoms, or I should say just the cause of the symptoms, because in many cases, it might not actually be a disease. It could be a nutrient imbalance, for example, or it could be pesticide. It could be a pesticide burn. It could be wind burn. It could be heat stress, drought stress. A lot of these abiotic factors as well. So first off is, I've got what's wrong with my plant. This is what I see. Okay, what's causing these symptoms? And then if it's an insect or a disease, making sure that we can actually identify which one is causing the symptoms. And in many cases, once you get familiar with some of the really common ones, like you have someone with a mango tree, and they're the whole panicle, all the flowers are black, and you see the little black spots, you can say, well, I don't need to send it to the lab. I'm like 98% sure that this is an anthracnose problem. Once you build up that familiarity, and doing that outreach in the community, working the helpline is like super, super great way to just kind of build up your own familiarity with these things. Because the first time it comes in, maybe you do a little bit of research, look at CTAR page, reach out to extension agents, but after you've seen it twice, 3 times, then it's in your mind, and you'll be able to recognize it even driving down the road. But at the beginning, if you have a sample or you come across something you're not sure about, send that in for diagnostics. And on Kauai, actually on all of the islands, we have folks who are trained in entomology or pathology, who have a lot of experience too, and are great resources. So connect with those folks. And again, you'll learn a lot more about this in the IPM lecture. So this is just to show an example on mango, a different type of pest management. Sorry, if you Sam, mute, please. Great. So sorry about that. This is just an example of a different type of pest management tool, non-chemical option, pretty labor intensive. But if you want beautiful, beautiful mangoes, one option is to go out there and actually bag them. And this works for a lot of different types of fruit trees, actually, mango, guava, all kinds of things. If it's worth it to you, you can go out and you can take a bag, and that protects it from birds, it protects it from all kinds of things. You can do it really pretty early on, when the fruit is first starting to develop, even to protect it from fruit flies, for example. Again, not super practical unless your market really get like a really good price for a commercial grower. All right, cool. So I wanted to talk for a minute about banana and bunchy top virus. This is one of the major banana diseases that we're contending with here across the islands now. And I think it's really challenging to control. So if we're thinking about this virus in particular, it's vectored by an aphid. It's the banana aphid, which are these, you can see, and again, these publications are available online too, so you can zoom in and see much more clearly. But you can see this photo, the banana aphid. They're just these tiny little dark brown or black aphids. If you've ever tried to control aphids on anything in your garden, you know how difficult that is. So then you think about something like a banana clump where there's all these places for aphids to hide, and they love to hide down inside the leaf sheets. And then they vector this this virus that causes the bunchy top virus that causes the plants to basically be stunted. So as the name implies, you get these bunching tops. So that photo there shows the really characteristic pattern where when the keiki come out, the new leaves just don't unfurl, they don't expand properly, and you end up with this kind of rosette looking, or even looks kind of like a broom top to your young plant. And once you've seen it, again, once you've seen it once or twice, you'll be able to see it. All of a sudden, your eye will pick it out, and you'll see how widespread it is in the landscape. In addition to stunting the growth, if you have a tree that's infected and is already producing, you're going to get less fruit if you get any at all, and the fruit that comes out is also very, very misshapen. And part of the challenge here is that apple bananas, which are one of the more popular varieties, are a very, very susceptible host. So you think about, again, and where are bananas in the environment? They're everywhere here. So even if in our yard, say we have a clump that we recognize is infected, and we want to get rid of it, we need to make sure that we actually are able to kill all of those thousands of itty bitty little banana aphids before we take down the banana clump. Otherwise, we're not being very good neighbors, and we're not doing ourselves any favors either. Because if you cut the clump down or burn it down or dig it out any which way, all those aphids are just going to migrate over to your neighbor's clump or to that wild clump of bananas, and they're just going to keep on spreading the virus. So again, there's lots of details online about different control options, but just remembering, got to totally take care of those aphids first, either with something like horticultural oil, insecticidal soap, or if you other pesticide options. Deep down inside of each of those leaf sheaths, make sure that they're all gone as much as you can before taking that infected material out. So again, lots more details on ways to do this, but I encourage everyone to take the time to look at this one specifically, because I think we're going to get a lot of questions about this.
Have you found that the soapy water fulfills something?
Yeah, I mean, there are like something like Safer Soap, right? That's labeled for use in horticultural applications. That's where that's what I would recommend, is find something that's labeled for use designed for use on your plants, and then it's gonna just need to be really, really thorough and check it, come back and make sure that they're all gone.
You have any experience with Dr. Bronner's?
Dr. Bronner's?
Yeah.
For use in the garden?
Yeah.
I haven't, and again, I generally wouldn't necessarily recommend products that aren't designed for that use. Yeah. But any of the other agents want to chime in on that, thinking about using Dr. Bronner's in the garden?
This is Kalani. I'll just say, I've used Dr. Bronner's a lot in the nursery as an insecticidal soap generally, but it's not a labeled pesticide, so we usually don't recommend it. But for home gardeners, you're free to use it as a product, and it is effective, just like insecticidal soap.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kalani. Cool. So for folks who maybe couldn't hear that in the back of the room here, Kalani mentioned that he does use Bronner's in the greenhouse. And for home, it's not labeled for that use, but for home gardeners, it is effective and is an option. So we just tend necessarily not to recommend it, but that if that's what you're doing and you find it effective, that you're okay too.
How do you successfully burn a banana tree with a bunching top?
Sorry, one more time.
How do you successfully burn a bunching top banana? Because if you cut it, then you have the aphids spread. So ultimately, burning it would be the best option, right? But how do you do that?
So Yeah, so the question again is about how to take down the clump if it's infected with bunchy top and infested with aphids. So when I said, I was thinking when I'm burning it, like you can burn down the plant itself using an herbicide. If you're thinking about actually incinerating, like burning it that way, you know, for one thing, it's really hard to get permits, and the aphids are quick, like they're still gonna boogie out of there. Whatever method of getting rid of the plants, you need to make sure that you get rid of the aphids first. So there's methods with, so if you can take care of the aphids, then there's methods with either an herbicide or like mechanical. You know, you can chop down the tree and then like mulch it, you know, cover it with a tarp. Make sure that you're not getting any escapees. If there's any little aphids you might have missed, as much as possible, try to smother that. You might have, and then it's banana, right? So you're going to get regrowth. Even if you cut it, you're going to keep getting regrowth unless you dig that whole clump out. One approach, like a non-chemical approach, is to keep a tarp on there, let it regrow, chop, smother, and eventually it'll drain, it'll burn, it'll run out of energy. So let it do that a number of times until it stops regrowing. But it's a big task, and then getting everybody in your neighborhood, everybody on your island on board with doing this, it's just not feasible. So thinking back to the disease triangle, right? Like, what's another approach? We know that we have a great environment for it, and we know that the organism is here. What's another alternative? Yeah, get a different banana, exactly. So, you know, the future of apple bananas is, maybe apple bananas aren't the future here, where there's this high disease pressure. You know, we have to think about if you can find a resistant or a tolerant host of a variety of banana that's not as susceptible, which there are many good ones, that would be the way to go. So that's exactly the kind of conversation you might want to have with a home gardener who comes in and says, man, I love bananas, but what am I going to do? One more question?
Yeah. So from the farming, I learned that a lot of times the ants will bring the aphids in. So what is causing, the cause of the aphids attacking the banana thing? And how come you have to completely remove the plant once it's infested instead of treating it and then seeing if it bounces back?
Okay, so there are two questions from one of the folks here in the Kauai. The first question is, you know, from previous experience thinking about aphids, they know that often ants will farm aphids. Ants will bring aphids onto your plants. So is that happening here? And then the second question is to do, well, why do you need to remove the plants versus just treating them? So I'll address that backwards. So first off, when we're talking about virus, there is no treatment per se. There's no antiviral that you can give to the plants that's going to get the virus out. So even if you kill all the aphids, basically your tree is just hanging out there for that next aphid to come from a mile down the road, and they can travel very, very far, even on the wind, very far. You know, so you get another aphid comes back, and again, you're just a reservoir for that disease, for that virus. So it's really important to do both. Kill as many of the aphids as you can, and then get that virus infected material out of the environment by destroying it. And then the other part, the aphids, in this case with the banana aphids, I don't see the same, you're totally right. Often ants farm aphids for honeydew, and there's lots of these kind of complex relationships between disease and aphids and ants and other plants. In banana, my understanding is that the ants aren't as important here. That the aphids, they will actually change and grow wings and fly of their own volition when the plant becomes weak enough. So they'll hang out and they'll basically just sap it, suck it dry. And when that plant becomes so diseased and so weak, then they get a signal. They're like, okay, time to move on to the next. And they actually just get up and move on their own. Yeah, great questions though. You good online, Susan? Okay, cool. All right. Great. So I'm going to kind of just cruise really quickly as you in the sake of time, and I know you're going to have the IPM lecture that'll delve more deeply into this. So just a quick survey for citrus, some of the major diseases to keep an eye out for. Citrus tristeza virus. This is another one that's aphid vectored. And citrus scab. Wait, where'd the photo go? Okay, no photo. Citrus scab is a fungal disease, affects especially the leaves and the twigs and the fruit. So for that, you want to find resistant varieties as much as possible. Gummosis is another one. And gummosis is caused by Phytophthora. And then Huanglongbing or citrus greening is a big one to keep an eye out for. So in this case, citrus greening is one of these major citrus diseases you might have heard of before, really decimating the Florida citrus industry. And I heard recently in the last couple of years some concerns about cases in the region of the Mexico-California border as well. And here in Hawaii, we're very lucky. We don't have the disease. It's actually caused by a bacterium, but it's vectored by an insect that is the Asian citrus psyllid. And we have citrus and we have the psyllid, but we don't have the bacterium here to our knowledge yet. So something to keep, educate yourselves about and keep an eye out for, because the more eyes on, the better. So we can catch these things early and then just hope that it doesn't reach our shores. Because if it does, we've got all of the other factors to support this being a major disease here. And coconut rhinoceros beetle. So this is a big one. It was just first detected back in 2013 at the Pearl Harbor area at the military base there. And to my knowledge, it has not been identified yet on any of the other islands still. But it is spreading on Oahu, and it's a major, major pest of coconuts and other palms as well, including the native Lolu palm. So these are huge, huge beetles, as you can see in the photo. And the larva is also huge. So again, very characteristic. Keep an eye out for these. They are potentially devastating pests. Think about how ubiquitous palms are in our environment here, and see the kind of damage that they actually do. So but keeping an eye out for the beetles and the grubs is one thing, for the larvae is one thing, but keeping an eye out for the damage on the palms might be even an easier indicator. And here, just a photo of what that looks like. To me, where I've seen it before, it always reminds me of like a big cartoon shark came and just took bites out of the leaf, like really distinctive triangular chunks taken out of the fronds. And that's the damage from the larvae. They actually bore these holes into the young leaves and the fronds before they've unfurled. And then once they open, you know, it's like when you're making the little cutouts at the holidays, right, in paper. And when they unfurl, it gives that very characteristic pattern. And this is a photo from Guam. Each of these are not light poles. These are coconut palm trunks. And you can see how intense the devastation is from this pest. So keep an eye out for them. Again, the more eyes on, the better. And if you do see any damage or you find any larvae, please reach out to either Cooperative Extension or to the Department of Agriculture to report that, so that our beautiful landscape doesn't suffer the same fate. Okay, and then briefly on weed control, there's a lot of different options when we're thinking about orchards. So living mulches is a good way to go. This is basically like growing something else. And in many cases, it can even be grass. And then it's easier. You can just mow it and keep it under control so that it's not going to compete too much with your fruit trees. Herbicide is one option. Intercropping is another. So intercropping is basically it's like not quite a living mulch, something that you're planting with the desire to harvest from it as well. So starting to get into more complicated, maybe like an agroforestry type setting even, where you can think about ways to utilize the space between your fruit trees for other crops to keep more of that soil covered, suppress weeds, and there's a lot of other benefits to that as well. Also, animal control is an option. So sometimes integrating grazers, for example, but making sure that especially your young trees are protected so that they don't get damaged. And thinking about what type of grazers you might want to integrate, of course, is another aspect to manage as well. And then, of course, hand weeding is always an option, as well as physical barriers like weed mat and things like that. And because fruit flies are one of the major pests and also one of the very common home gardener questions, I'm going to take a little bit of time to focus on them here and run through some slides that Dr. Rosemary Gutierrez over on Maui had put together. And Rosemary is an entomologist, and I would definitely recommend if you have questions about fruit flies. She's an awesome resource and a wonderful person to talk to. Gutierrez. Great. So there are four major fruit flies, and of course we have new pests arriving all the time, but four main fruit flies that we have here in Hawaii. And I'll also say a lot of this information that you'll see in the next slides comes from this publication here, which is Easy as 1, 2, 3 Fruit Fly Suppression in Hawaii, which really is a great resource for master gardeners and also to share with home growers, that walks through the process pretty clearly. And thinking back to our good pest management practices, first thing we want to start with is identifying our pest, making sure we know which fly that we're actually dealing with so that we can manage it most appropriately. When we're looking at fruit trees, primarily we're going to find the Mediterranean fruit fly. And again, I'm not an entomologist, so to me, I'm like, oh, at first glance, they all look like fruit flies. But if you can actually catch one and then look closely, there are differences, and then you can identify which one you're dealing with. But generally, if you're in higher elevations and you have problems in your fruit, you probably have the Mediterranean fruit fly. That's the upper right. And then if you're in the lower elevations, you might see the Oriental fruit fly. That's that one on the lower left. And the other two tend to be more of vegetable pests. And just in 2019, we got another fruit fly identified here on the island. So this is the olive fruit fly. There's a new pest advisory that came out. So these are what to keep an eye out for. The Department of Ag does their best to identify pests as they arrive, and then they'll put out these advisories as soon as possible to really let people know that there's something new in the neighborhood that we want to keep an eye out for and try to control before it gets out of hand. And the olive fruit fly is primarily a pest in olives. To my knowledge, it hasn't been identified on any other hosts here. But for folks who are growing olives, like on Hawaii Island, for example, and maybe other places in the state, it's a significant pest of concern because in some cases for table olives, it can result in 100% loss of your crop. And just to show quickly the life cycle, this is just an example. I won't belabor this, but after you've identified which pest you have, another really important aspect is understanding their life cycle as well, so that you can recognize and identify and really key out when is the most effective time for control practices. So by understanding what their life cycle is, for example, if I'm using a spray of some sort, you know, is the larvae safely nestled inside the fruit and not going to be affected by it? Or is this something that I can target? Can I target the adults? And again, understanding how best to get that control. So once we've identified which fruit fly we have, and we've understood the life cycle, and recognize, you know, if we're having males or females, both, but by keeping a track of the balance in the population, then we can jump into that 1, 2, 3 steps of control. And step 1 is field sanitation. So this is that prevention, and so important, not just for fruit flies, but for all kinds of pest and disease management. So sanitation techniques, really thinking about how can we keep our garden, our orchard, as clean as possible. So for example, if we do have material that's, you know, if we have fruit that's infested with fruit flies, what can we do with it to get rid of it? First, make sure that you're getting it out from under your trees, getting it off of your trees. Don't leave it hanging, and don't let it just compost or break down underneath the trees. Make sure that you're composting it and getting it up to a temperature that's high enough to actually kill any of the larvae that might be in there. If you're burying it, that's another option. Make sure that you bury it deep enough. This recommends at least 18 inches. So again, deep enough so that it's not going to find its way back to the surface. And then if you're working on a smaller scale, for example, if you only have one tree, you might be able to actually just bag and dispose of the material. So again, whether it's a diseased leaves or fruit that's infested with fruit flies, so a lot of these principles apply the same way. So for a small scale, you can bag and toss it. At a commercial scale, that's not going to be feasible. Then for fruit flies, another option is actually just drowning them. So this is taking the fruit and submerging it in water for long enough that they'll drown. Keeping in mind that this is not going to be fruit that you're eating, and also that once you do take it out of the water, you didn't drown them all, it's still a potential source for reinfestation. Animal feed is a good option. So if you or your neighbors have livestock that you can take your culls, take these infested fruits to and feed it to the animals, that's great. And then also grinding it up is another option. So again, a little more labor intensive, not going to be very practical at scale unless you have a huge grinder. And the last one on here is an augmentorium. So this is an example of using biological control with beneficial insects, where you are rearing beneficial insects and then releasing them out. So that could be something like a parasitoid, for example. Super interesting realm of study, and I'll just leave that as a teaser for the IPM lecture when that comes up. Great. So if you're doing your sanitation and you're trying to keep your population as low as possible, another part of the control is using protein baits. So the bait is called a GF120, and these are used, I believe, to attract the males. So this is a poison bait, again, just another technique for keeping the population low. And then the third part is trapping. And this is a pretty easy option. You can make traps at home. This used to be a really common outreach activity master gardeners would do at outreach events or at the help desk when people would come in, and show them ways to make the trap themselves, and then make sure that the lure you're using for your trap is appropriate to the fly that you've got. So again, just refer back to the literature and match the right fly to the right lure. And this is also a really great way to keep an eye on the population, right? So if you're doing this kind of trapping, it gives you a sense about what your population, your pest pressure actually is. Cool. This is where I'd originally put in a break. Do we want to keep cruising or take another quick break?
So it's around 11. So you've been keeping it 12.
How's everyone feeling? You feel like you need a quick break, or you want to keep going? Keep going? All right, cool. So this next section, I think that was the majority of kind of the some of more the technical material. And the next section, I wanted to talk a bit about what grows here.
Emily, can you hear me, Emily?
Oh yeah.
Is there any way we could take just a few minute break? We have a couple people over in Hilo.
Okay, definitely. Yeah. Let's see, my clock says 10:57. You want to meet back at 11:05?
Yep, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for letting me know.
Emily, can you hear me? This is Phyllis Fong speaking, Master Gardener on Oahu.
Hi Phyllis, how are you doing?
Okay, I've been really enjoying this class or workshop, so I really appreciate it. What I wanted to know is, I might have missed the first part where you might have mentioned it, but a few years ago, a speaker said that there was a place where you could buy a papaya, I'll call it cutting / shoot from a hermaphrodite. And it was like about $9. Do you know where that might be?
I'm not sure. You know, I know that they do cutting propagation of papayas. And I don't know, I mean, I would check, you could check with the plant nurseries around.
Hey, Emily, I know the answer.
Oh,
great.
Russell.
It's Russell over here. So you got HARC, Hawaii Ag Research Center was for a while doing hermaphroditic cutting sales. You got to call them and see if they have any. I'm not sure if that program is still running or how their distribution policy is right now. But calling HARC and asking about the papayas is the way to go. Yeah, Maureen.
Thank you, Russell.
Yeah,
Awesome, thanks Russell.
yeah, no problem.
Russell, do you know if they're doing banana as well in tissue culture? I think that program might have gone by the wayside even longer ago.
So last time I talked to Maureen, I know they had been doing some banana tissue culture, but the big focus they're on right now is or macro tissue culture, whatever that's called for the bananas, is green tea and then possibly red ginger. So right now, I mean, Amjad would be the guy to talk to about who's doing bananas.
Great.
Yeah, I feel like the resource he would have the most knowledge on whether or not HARC's still doing that. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, Emily. Can I ask you another question? This is Phyllis.
Sorry, Phyllis, one sec, then I'll get to your question. We're having a conversation about pruning these out of control lychee trees. And I was suggesting, yeah, look, talk to an arborist who, you know, really give you some specific guidelines and has the experience and also the technical skill and maybe liability insurance to get up in these huge trees too. Yeah, the one that we had in our backyard, and one of my housemates there is an arborist. He would look at it every day. I really want to cut that tree out of the tree that's growing in the middle of the tree out of that tree. And you could see where there was even a difference in the color of the leaves, where it just wanted so badly to have this middle section of the crown removed to really open up the canopy. But it was just huge. I mean, it's, you know, 35 feet tall, and it's a massive project. Phyllis, what was the question?
So regarding the mango trimming, you know, is there, I've watched videos before where they talk about how to keep your mango tree, you know, growing it small and keeping it small and then cutting it every so often to cause it to grow. And, you know, anyway, is there a time where you shouldn't be cutting it so often? Meaning if our goal is to, there's a farmer who wants to not have the tree grow more than 8 feet, but still have a lot of fruit on it. And so he started cutting it anytime there was a oh, what do you call that thing? Where you get 4 leaves that come out in one section, and then he would cut it right there, so it would encourage other shoots from coming out. But I thought it was only supposed to be no more than once or twice a year, depending upon how frequent you get your fruit.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for folks in the room here, Phyllis on Oahu had a question about pruning mango. If you really wanted to keep your trees small, like not let it go beyond 8 feet, and a person she knew who was pruning it anytime that there was basically a node set that had the 4 branches coming out of it, or 4 shoots coming out of it, and if you can prune too much. So, you know, I think that's a really good question. And I don't know specifically, maybe one of the other coordinators or agents could chime in on this, but my understanding is generally we prune once a year. I mean, you could prune twice a year, you know, but to really clip it back every single time seems a bit much to me. But you know, there's what I'd refer them to also are these ultra high density mango. If it's mango specifically, there's work being done on ultra high density mango production, where folks are doing just that. They've planted their trees at much closer spacing than normal, and they are probably the vanguard of this very intensive pruning. But even there, I don't know how often they're actually going through their orchard. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm not sure on the neighbor islands, but here on Kauai, Umi Martin, who is a very progressive mango grower, and also now the president of our local chapter of the Hawaii Tropical Fruit Growers, is an awesome resource, and he would be happy to talk mangoes with you and answer any questions, I'm sure. So if you get a chance, I would connect with Umi on that.
You said his name is Louis?
Umi, U-M-I, Martin.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great. So any questions on the material we've covered so far before we jump into the next section? Cool. I think we've been doing a pretty good job keeping up with questions throughout. So thank you all for that. I appreciate the engagement. All right, so next thing, let me minimize this. Okay, great. So next I wanted to talk a little bit about what grows here. So, I mean, what does grow here? Pretty much everything, right? Well, almost everything. But commercially, there are some crops that bring in much greater revenue than others. So this data, again, is a little bit old. This is 2014 from the National Agricultural Statistical Service, the USDA, and it just shows, you know, coffee by acreage and by dollars is really our biggest fruit and nut crop, followed by macadamia nut, then bananas and papayas, and others taking up less from there. And some of this, I think, you know, we've lost, for example, some significant banana production in recent years, some significant banana acreage. So these numbers are probably a little bit different. But this is something that I think is always in the forefront of my mind anyway. So, you know, I think we all understand we import the majority of our food, 85 to 90% of our food is being imported here. And these are the top 10 imported commodities by weight, not by dollar value, but by weight, from 2016. So again, a little bit old. Hopefully Department of Ag puts out some new numbers. But what really jumps out, so the fruit crops are circled here, and oranges are number 1. And it's crazy, right? So hopefully you're all shaking your heads and chuckling at that. Onions, potatoes, carrots, 2, 3, 4, melons, number 5, lettuce, Number 7, apples. Okay, can't, apples are hard to grow here. Grapes, yeah, grapes are also a little bit challenging. Peppers and tomatoes. So possibly with the exception of apples, I mean, we grow all of this stuff here in the islands, and yet we're importing massive amounts. And then again, remembering number 1 on this list is oranges, but we grow a boatload. We grow boatloads of citrus here across the island. So again, kind of thinking about, the way that we, because of course, as we're gardeners, we're farmers, maybe some of us, but we're also all consumers, right? So thinking about the choices that we're making and the choices that all of our neighbors are making as well, whether that be our resident neighbors or the visitors that come to the island, the foods that we're serving in the restaurant, and why are we importing some of these things that we're also growing? And there's reasons for all of that, right? There are some things that are just plain illogical, but there's reasons for that. So reasons around seasonality, taste preferences, and other things of that nature. So just food for thought there. But we do grow plenty of oranges. Some other fruits, breadfruit. That's the Artocarpus alpillus. It's a Polynesian canoe plant and important staple crop across Polynesia. So hopefully this is something that everyone has tasted, but if not, I'd encourage you all to, when you get the opportunity, to do so. And there's a lot of different cultivars available. We have some growing here at the station. There's also, I think all of the research stations across the state pretty much have some breadfruit trials that have been planted to explore different varieties. And if you do, I'll just do a quick plug. When you come over to visit us here on Hawaii, if you have the opportunity to go down to the National Tropical Botanical Garden, visit the Breadfruit Institute. They've got some really cool agroforestry plantings and lots of breadfruit trees there to check out too. Also, Noah Lincoln and the Breadfruit Co-op over on Hawaii Island are doing a lot of work in kind of this renaissance or revival of the breadfruit industry here, which is super cool. So this whole section is just a bit of a tour to get some familiarity with different fruits. I know for folks, some folks maybe grew up here and are very familiar. Others have moved to the islands more recently and may be less familiar. So just to give a sample, and again, this is just a tiny little teaser of all of the incredible diversity of fruit that's out there. So mountain apple, the Syzygium malacensis, also known as Ohia or Malay apple, rose apple, water apple, or I say an apple by any other name would taste as sweet. Just to say, this is one that for me is particularly confounding. Locally, mountain apple or Ohia that I always knew from Southeast Asia as rose apple before, and wondering, is it the same? Is it not the same? Common names vary a lot, and there's often local names for the plants that we eat. So if you want to be very clear, it's important, whether you can pronounce it or not, to make sure that you have the scientific name, so that when you're having a conversation with someone or looking for technical resources online, that you are sure that you're getting, that you're talking about the plant that you think you're talking about. And this is also a canoe crop and one of the first plants that the earliest Polynesian settlers brought over, along with the breadfruit came a little bit later. But the mountain apple, the Ohia was one of the very first crops they brought. And then bananas. So these are Musa species. There's, again, this incredible diversity out there. So thinking back to banana bunchy top, if the apple bananas are super susceptible, well, here from Ken Love is a selection of the bananas that are grown just on Hawaii Island. So I think we've got some good candidates out there that we can start looking for maybe more tolerant, more resistant varieties to substitute the apple banana. That'll be just as tasty and much easier to grow. And this is a banana flower here on the left for anyone who hasn't seen those. And the flower itself is also edible. Mangoes, of course, we talked a lot about mangoes. Again, incredible profusion of flowers. This is from a tree in Moloa'a on the east side of Kauai. And again, the incredible diversity of varieties that we have here in the islands. So anonas, these are from the Ananaceae family. Examples include Rollinia, soursop, also cherimoya and edamoya. So if you get a chance to try these, I always encourage folks, like, because there are so many fruits and they're all so different. Like if you see something in the marketplace you've never seen before, take the investment to get it for yourself and try it out, just so that you can share with friends, so that you can have that experience and know what it is, because there's just so many great fruits out there. And the Rollinia, easiest way to just eat it with a spoon, it's less messy, but it tastes like pie. It tastes like a custard pie. Very, very sweet, very smooth consistency. And then the related species, Annona muricata, is a soursop. It's one of my favorites, a little bit grittier texture, and a more sour, but very complex, very interesting flavor and aroma. This is the Annona squamosa, so sugar apple or sweet sop, some people call it. You can actually, this is one of my favorites, super fun. You can like pick off actually each of the little sections of the rind, comes off separately. Chock full of seeds, but super, super delicious. And then we have sapote. So James found some of these in the market. We have a few you get to try at the end of the session today. And sapote is a term from, I understand it came from Nahuatl term, which is just soft edible fruit. So you have all kinds of things that are called sapote, black sapote, white sapote, and meme sapote, and they're not necessarily related species at all. They just have similar soft edible fruits. So this is an example of the black. There's a Diospyros nigra, and then the white sapote, Casimaroa edulis. Again, not related. A couple others, the meme zapote, which I think we have a chance to get to taste here today. And I apologize to all our friends on the neighbor islands. I encourage you to go out to the market and do your own taste tests whenever you can. And then the chiku or sapadilla, Manicara zapata is another popular favorite. And I found this online. They're selling an 8-pound box of sapadilla on sale for $99. Free shipping. Marked down from $129. So again, we're pretty spoiled here. When you see them in the marketplace, they're delicious. Grab one, try one for yourself. Or you can spend $100 on an 8-pound box and have it delivered to your door. This is a mammy apple, the Mame americana, not to be confused with the Meme zapote, of similar name, different. Tastes like a crisp apricot. And passion fruit, the lilikoi, again, should be somewhat ubiquitous in the landscape. There are some varieties that are invasive and quite problematic. And then other garden varieties, which again, they're vines, so there's always that potential for invasiveness, but not quite as damaging to the environment. They come in yellow and purple, and the Jamaican is a kind of fuzzy skinned, but they all have these different varieties, incredibly beautiful, showy flowers too, which are also quite fragrant. langsat or lanzones. So this is an interesting one. It tastes a little bit like grapefruit, but not nearly as sour. And also has some latex on the fruit in the rind. So when you peel it, it's a bit sticky, but it has these white sections that pop out. Usually there'll be a big seed in at least one of them. So santal is another one. This one you can actually candy the rind, or you can suck on the seed and get the pulp from around that. Keep an eye out in the market. So salak or snake fruit, this is an interesting one. If you look, you can kind of see that has a very like beyond rough textured, almost like these overlapping sharp scales on the fruit itself. And it grows on a palm that you can see also has these kind of fierce looking spikes at the bottom of it. So something different and interesting from Southeast Asia to keep an eye out for. And if somebody has already harvested it for you, you don't have to worry about the spines. So the cabalura, this is from Brazil, and there's all kinds, not surprisingly, right? You think about Amazon and all the incredible plants there that we barely know anything about. There's tons and tons and tons and tons of fruit that comes out of the forest out of Brazil. And this was one of the themes of the Tropical Fruit Growers Conference here in Hawaii a couple years back. So this is one of those fruits from Brazil. It grows kind of like a sprawling bush, and again has a flavor a little bit like apricot. Star apple is an interesting one. We'll get a chance to taste that today, I believe. Hopefully it's nice and ripe. Also has a bit of latex. So sometimes these plants that have a bit of latex, I find that they're easier to eat with a spoon than just biting right into. So another family is Sapondaceae. This is rambutan, longan, and also related lychee. So they're super fun, thin rinds. You just, it's a rambutan here on the left. These are very soft. They're not spiny at all, but looks kind of alien. They come in different colors too. Some of them are super neon. Then you can kind of just pop that rind open. There's a fruit inside with a single pit on the inside. And longan similar, but doesn't have those kind of wild looking hairs. Similar flavor too, I'd say. So mangosteen, this is known in Southeast Asia as the queen of fruits. So Garcinia mangostana, dark purple, they come in primarily, this is a purple mangosteen, so it comes in dark purple. Outside will totally stain your hands when you pull the rind open. And then this absolutely bright white flesh on the inside. If you start to see some yellow sap, it's overripe, it's starting to rot, and it will not be as pleasurable. You want to get it when it's nice and fresh. Very, very short shelf life. Again, that's a common theme for a lot of these tropical fruits, right? So that's why when you're traveling elsewhere outside of the tropics, a lot of them are just not available at all. So mangosteen is similar, short shelf life, but when you get them and they're good, they're the queen of fruits. There's also yellow mangosteen, so it's another Garcinia, and these are very, very sour. We have a tree actually growing across the road here in Wailua, and I've had some fruits on it that are even sweet though, and they are quite tasty. It's good to use for juice. Traditionally used as a dye. I think the mangosteen, purple mangosteen rind is also used in many different ways. But again, these are super sour. So if you're doing a tasting and you have a fruit tasting set up with your friends, you might want to include miracle fruit, so-called miracle fruit, Syncypalum dulcificum with that. And if you look at the species name, dulce as in dulce, right, from sweet. So it kind of gives that sense. You eat these, anything that you eat afterwards is going to taste sweet in your mouth, whether it's a lemon or a yellow mangosteen or anything else. And it wouldn't be right to mention the queen without the king. So this is durian of much fame and infamy, and super, super popular across Southeast Asia. Very popular among connoisseurs and people who know, and also very unpopular with many others. It has an extremely potent smell. And if you're traveling in Southeast Asia, you'll see a lot of places, like in the public transit, for example, where you have a little picture of a durian with the circle and the line through it. No durian allowed, no cutting durian. And I can attest to the power of it. I was able, in a hotel room, to smell the durian with all the windows and doors closed from our neighbor's hotel room, with all of their windows and doors closed as well. It was like, oh, here's the durian, guys. Got it. But also has a really sometimes tastes like a sweet buttered caramel if you get a good one, and tastes like rotten onions and old socks if you get a bad one. But try it. I'll also say they're wicked sharp and super, super hard rinds. They're like cannonballs with these super sharp spikes on them. So use caution when handling, and maybe not the best tree to set a hammock underneath during the season. Cool. Next is the canistel or egg fruit. And these are in season here now, at least on Kauai. I've been seeing them in the market. So we'll have a chance to taste them for folks. And then again, our friends on the neighbor islands, now's the season. So you can get out and try these if you haven't before. Jackfruit. So this is an artocarpus. And does anybody remember the artocarpus that we talked about earlier? Breadfruit, awesome. I can't hear you guys out there, but I'm sure you all said breadfruit. So they're related in the same genus. Really tasty fruit. Again, lots of latex. So it's good if you have like you can have like a designated jackfruit knife. Very pungent smell, and this is the aroma similar to juicy fruit gum. I understand the juicy fruit got their inspiration from jackfruit. So a little bit more, one more technical thing here I know it's been a long session, but avocados, I think, are a really important crop, also super, super popular, both for home growers and for small farmers. And they are a little bit complicated in their flowering. So you mentioned avocado tree can have over 1 million flowers on it, but they exhibit this kind of unusual flowering behavior where the flower will basically be mature over a 2-day period, but the timing of the female maturity and the male maturity is separated. So the flower actually will open, and the female will be receptive, and then it'll close again. And on the second day, it'll open again, and the male will be receptive. And there's 2 different groups that's where the timing is a little bit different, but they follow that pattern: female first and male second. And just to show kind of what that looks like, you want to just check for whichever variety. Again, if you have a seedling, you have no idea what variety it is necessarily, but if you have a known variety, you can look up the cultivar and see if it's an A type or a B type. And the A type is the female is mature in the morning the first day and closes, and then as the male on the afternoon of the second. And the B type is the female in the afternoon on that first day, again closes overnight and opens again as a mature male on the second morning. So why is this important? If you want to have really the optimum production, a lot of times you might plant both an A and a B type if you can. You'll still get some fruit even if you only have 1 tree, but you can really optimize your production if you have more than one. And what you're getting is this kind of pollen flow, because actually at any given time, right, there's all these hundreds or thousands of mature flowers at a given time in the field on a given day. And then just understanding that in the morning, you're getting pollen flow from one variety. In the morning, you're going to get pollen flow from a B to an A. And in the afternoon, you're getting pollen flow from an A to a B. Yeah, I said that right. Okay, cool. If you want to dig into more on this, there's a good resource from the University of California avocado program too, that kind of break down some of the botany for you. But when I was looking at the list of avocado examples A versus B in California, I just shook my head. All they have that we grow here are the Haas and the Charwell, and their list is like yay long. So we've got tons and tons of awesome avocados. I don't know which ones are A's and which ones are B's, but that information is definitely out there, so you can dig into the to the internet and find the answer. And I'll also refer to Ty over in Kona as a good resource person for avocados. Cool. Papaya, another super common, right? I think probably everyone is familiar with the papaya trees by now, but wanted to address a common question that we get from home gardeners, and why doesn't my papaya set fruit? We've got this beautiful tree, like the leaves look awesome, maybe there's flowers on it, and no fruit. What's up? So papaya is an interesting one because actually the sex of the papaya trees is super complex. So there's 3 types of tree that you might have, either a female, a hermaphrodite, or a male. So if you have a male papaya tree, you have no ovaries to develop into fruit. You will never have any fruit on that tree. And if you have a female tree, often you'll get these very round fruits, usually no seeds, sometimes seeds, but often no seeds, and they often abort early before they develop. So commercially, what we're most interested in for production are these hermaphrodite trees. So during the break, there was a question about somebody on Oahu. The Hawaii Ag Research Center used to sell, maybe still does, cuttings of the hermaphrodite papaya, so that cuts out that guesswork. You know that you have a hermaphrodite tree, and you're going to get good fruit consistently. Otherwise, when you plant papaya, plant 3 seeds, and then you can tell by the flower shape if it's female, hermaphrodite, or male. And so once you see flowers, then you can cull that down to just the one healthiest hermaphrodite tree. Cool. And I'm going to skip over part of this. It's in the slides, but just to talk a few slides here about cacao as a crop of interest that's also experiencing a lot of growth right now across the state. They are super beautiful trees. They have these very minute, delicate little flowers that come right out of, in many cases, the trunk of the tree, and it sets the pod. And then we can, when the pods are mature, we take the beans out. That's what we actually make chocolate from, are the beans of the cacao. There's also the fruit, the pulp around the seeds is really delicious. Again, almost no shelf life. So if you get a chance to try a fresh pod and actually eat that fruit, it's super tasty. And I'm going to skip over, a little short on time, but propagation, pests and diseases. Again, if you want to look back through these, you're welcome to. And then actually taking those seeds to make chocolate yourself, it goes through a fermentation process, which is important for flavor development in the bean, but also to get that pulp off of the seeds, off of the beans. Drying to stop the fermentation, and then either eating them raw or processing them somehow. And some of the most common home gardener questions that we get are, how do I control for Chinese rose beetle? The Chinese rose beetle, the damage is super characteristic. They're a very annoying little beetle that love to eat a lot of our garden plants. And it looks like buckshot, basically on the leaves, so that lots and lots of holes. And for cacao, we just use the cloth covered cages when the trees are young until they're big enough to basically withstand some of the feeding from the beetles. And then another question we often get is, can I make chocolate at home? Right? Like eating the cacao is great, but some people have a real taste for chocolate. And yes, you can actually. There's a publication on making this chocolate from scratch that you can do at home. So again, check out the CTAR publication. It walks through ways to do this in a very, very small batch kind of way. So even if you have a few trees, it might be enough. You can make your own chocolate at home. Awesome. So with that, I'll say mahalo nui loa. I appreciate all of you for having me today and for taking time out of your busy schedules to tune in from across the islands. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me anytime. Email is definitely the best way. And if you don't get a response back after a week, please send a follow-up. The email is like an avalanche and things get buried quickly. But I always appreciate follow-ups and reminders. Yeah, thank you all. And then for the folks who are here, we have more fun with fruits. So this is a cultural thing, an art form in Southeast Asia, especially in Thailand, where they do this fruit carving. So the image on the far right is a watermelon that they've carved into a